a whisper in her sleep. They say
Ezra,
some secrets
Ezra,
only visit us in
Ezra.
dreams, and sometimes you'll wish you
Ezra,
never woke up because
Ezra,
the truth
Ezra,
in daylight can hurt more than any
Ezra,
nightmare.
Ezra.
The sky
Ezra.
was still. A small countryside church in rural Georgia echoed with the soft hum of Sunday morning hymns. Pastor Marvin Lee, a black man with calm eyes and a voice that wrapped around you like a winter blanket, was preaching about faith, forgiveness, and loyalty in marriage. The congregation listened closely, but as his gaze swept over the front row, she was there. Clarice, the wife he once believed was a gift from God, a living portrait of virtue, of devotion. But last night she whispered another man's name in her sleep. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a moan, gentle, tender, soaked in longing, and the name came again and again. Ezra. Marvin stood still behind the pulpit. His hands trembled ever so slightly. His lips recited scripture, but his heart was quietly shattering. Lord, he prayed inwardly, I need to know who that man is. Chapter 1. The Name Whispered in Sleep. It wasn't a breath. It wasn't a cry. It was a moan, soft, slow, and carrying a name. Ezra. Again. Don't stop. Marvin opened his eyes. The bedroom ceiling glowed a faint orange under the street lamp outside, its light slipping through the thin curtains, and his wife Clarice was still asleep beside him. She moaned again, softly, slowly, as if she were somewhere else, with someone else. Ezra. He turned his head to look at her, one cheek pressed into the pillow, strands of dark hair loosely scattered across her face. Her breath was warm, even, but her lips still moved with that name, as if holding on to a pleasure she wasn't ready to let go of. Marvin lay still. He didn't shake her awake. He didn't say her name. Instead, he quietly reached for the drawer, pulled out a black leather notebook. Tonight marked the 7th entry. Friday, 2:46 a.m. She said Ezra again. This time she added, "You still know how to make me breathe like that." Clarice didn't know about the notebook. She didn't know her husband woke up every night not from insomnia, but from the quiet sting of betrayal whispered into their bed, in the shape of a name. The next morning, she was the same as ever, calm, attentive, gentle, breakfast just the way he liked it, his favorite toast, orange juice with a few drops of honey just as she'd done for the past 10 years. She didn't ask if he'd slept well. She didn't need to, because she had no idea that when he was awake, it was because she was dreaming. "I'm not that hungry," Marvin said, voice low, eyes avoiding hers. Clarice frowned. "Are you tired?" He shook his head. I think I just need to pray more." That evening, as they read scripture together like always, Marvin paused mid-verse. His hand trembled, not from age, but from the weight of the words. "Thou shalt not covet." The verse echoed in his chest like a blade moving slowly through belief. Clarice placed a hand on his shoulder. You okay? He nodded, but deep down, he knew he was beginning to crack. Not from a single moment, but from a question that played over and over, like a sad old song. That name wasn't Marvin. He started noticing everything. The way she brushed her hair when staring into the distance. The soft smile she gave whenever an old soul song played on the radio. The silence she offered whenever he asked about her younger days. Clarice had never cheated not in action, but Marvin was starting to realize you can betray loyalty with memory. That night, when Clarice whispered the name again for the 8th time in less than 2 weeks, Marvin got out of bed, stepped out onto the back porch. He sat in the old wooden chair, looked up at the stars, and cried. Not loud, not wild, just a quiet, broken sob. From a man who had tried to do everything right and still felt like he'd never be enough. Not young enough, not desirable enough, not enough to hold on to a woman's heart, when that heart had once tasted a passion he'd never touched. And in the hollow of his chest, one question began to echo like thunder. Who is Ezra? Chapter 2. The Pastor's Suspicion. There was one thing Marvin Lee always believed. The devil doesn't knock with horns or fire. He comes wrapped in memories. And in all his years, Marvin had never felt his spirit this disturbed, not because of a man, but because of a name, a moan, a whisper in the dark from the woman he called his wife. Clarice lived like the perfect pastor's wife, on time for service, cooking for the community, smiling gracefully for the congregation. But Marvin had started noticing things. Things only a husband and a pastor would see. The silence between her sentences, the way she flinched at unexpected sounds, the distant look in her eyes, as if she were listening to music no one else could hear. One afternoon, while Clarice was folding laundry in the bedroom, Marvin walked in without a sound. She startled and quickly tucked a small piece of paper into the drawer. He didn't ask, but that night, while she was out teaching the girls' Bible study group, Marvin opened the drawer in silence. Beneath a pile of old sweaters, he found a letter aged, yellowed, the ink smudged by time, but still clear enough to read. If you're reading this, it means you chose the church, but I'll still wait for you, at the same place, no matter how many years pass. I'll be here. Ezra. Marvin's hands trembled, not out of jealousy, but from a fear every good man knows too well. Not the fear of being betrayed, but the fear that maybe you never truly had her heart to begin with. That night, Marvin didn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, the soft glow of the lamp falling over the wooden crucifix of Christ, nailed to the cross, just like his heart suspended somewhere between forgiveness and pain. Lord, he whispered, I don't know if I'm jealous or just scared. The next morning, he asked her gently, Do you remember anyone named Ezra? Clarice was rinsing glasses. Her hands paused just for a beat. But to Marvin, that single pause was enough to strangle his breath. She turned with a smile. Ezra, no, I don't think so. The name sounds unfamiliar. Marvin smiled back, faintly. Yeah, I must have dreamed it. Strange kind of dream. She nodded and turned away, going back to the dishes, but Marvin saw it the way her shoulders tensed, as if her body was trying to hide something her mind couldn't control. That evening, after his sermon, Marvin took the car and drove around town. He didn't know what he was looking for. All he knew was his wife's sleep no longer belonged to him, and what once felt like a flicker of jealousy had grown into something deeper. A quiet investigation, led by a pastor who was losing faith in his own marriage. When he came home, he stood outside in the yard, looking through the bedroom window. She was inside, reading, hair loose over her shoulders, a cream-colored robe wrapped gently around her body like a memory he had never touched. And Marvin thought to himself, if this woman once loved a man named Ezra, then she once lived a life I never got to be part of. Chapter 3. The Man from Her Past. Atlanta, summer of 1998. Clarice was 27, not yet a pastor's wife, had never known the sound of church bells ringing like forgiveness. She only knew drums, soul music, and the wild rhythm of her heartbeat under dim lights, wrapped in the smoke and sound of late-night bars. She didn't sing for a living. She sang because it was the only thing that made her feel alive with her body, her voice, her unbound emotions. And then Ezra walked in. He wasn't the kind of man you'd call handsome. He was the kind of man who made a room fall silent. The moment he opened his mouth, his skin was a burnt honey brown, his eyes deep and knowing, and his voice, it sounded like it had rolled through mud, through midnight rain, through the kind of pain women secretly long to touch. He didn't flirt, didn't flatter. He just sat beside her after her set, poured a glass of bourbon, and said, "You sing like you've loved someone so hard, it tore you into pieces." Clarice only smiled, but that night, she didn't go home. They didn't have much time. Ezra was a drifting musician playing gigs across state lines, living off unreleased tracks and nights no one remembered in the morning. But to Clarice, Ezra wasn't a passing storm. He was her first hurricane. The kind of love that makes a woman ask, "How do you live another life?" After you've felt something like this. They lived together for nearly a year. Clarice got pregnant. They didn't marry. Ezra hated the idea of marriage, but he promised he'd be a good father. Then came that night after a late show out of town. Driving home, the rain poured hard. The car spun 3 times before crashing into a roadside ditch. Clarice survived. She lost the baby. Ezra disappeared a few days later. No message, no phone number, no body, no funeral. Some said Ezra died. Others said he ran. Only Clarice knew some people don't die. They dissolve into your pain and live there forever. A year later, she shaved her head and moved back in with her mother in Savannah. Her mother took her back to church, and on one cool autumn evening, during a quiet prayer service, Marvin Lee saw her for the first time. He never asked about the scar across her belly. never asked why her eyes looked like she'd just finished singing a sad love song. He just said, "God may not erase your past, but He can love you even while you're still remembering it." Clarice wept, and for the first time in 2 years, she slept through the night. But memories don't die. They don't need your heart to survive. Just a dream, a piece of an old song, a name, whispered in the dark. And 20 years later, that memory began to moan its way back into the bed of a pastor who thought he had saved a soul, but never truly touched the body of the woman lying beside him. Chapter 4. The Woman Between Worlds. When Clarice sleepwalked, no one called her name, no one woke her, no one dared, because when she walked through the night barefoot, in a silver-gray silk nightgown that barely clung to her shoulders, she looked like a ghost who still remembered the way back to a place she once loved. The first time Marvin saw her standing on the porch in the rain, he thought she was dreaming. But she wasn't. Clarice was awake, her eyes open, her lips moving, and her voice wasn't speaking to him. "I'm here. Ezra! Can you hear me?" That voice wasn't the Clarice Marvin knew. It was younger, softer, full of breath, like she was holding back something that should never be said out loud in the light of day. Marvin stood still behind the glass door. He didn't step outside, didn't speak, didn't touch her, because he was afraid that if he made a sound, the woman before him might vanish, right into the rain. The next morning, Clarice remembered nothing. "I sleepwalked." She laughed so innocently that Marvin felt like the one committing a sin just for witnessing a part of her she never meant anyone to see. But Marvin couldn't sit still anymore. He tracked down an old friend of Clarice's, Georgia, the drummer from her old band, now living on the edge of the city. In a quiet little cafe, Georgia looked at Marvin and spoke like someone digging up a ghost that should have stayed buried. "Ezra's not dead. Pastor, people just want to believe he is. After the accident, they never found a body. Some say he was spotted in Mississippi. Some say he went mad." She took a breath. I think he just ran. Ran from what? From the guilt of making the woman he loved most lose the child she prayed for her whole life. Marvin didn't respond. He just held his coffee. And for a moment he felt like a man who showed up late to the life his wife had already lived. A good man, but still a replacement, the one who came after the wreckage. That night, Marvin didn't pray. He just watched Clarice sleep. Her eyelids fluttered. Her hand clutched the edge of the blanket like she was trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping away. And then she whispered again, "Don't leave. Ezra!" Marvin turned away. And for the first time in over a decade of marriage, he felt like the other man. The next morning, he wasn't home. Clarice found a small envelope on the table. No name, no note, just a single old photograph. It was her, 1998, on stage. And beside her, Ezra. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her with eyes that knew he'd lose everything, but loved her anyway. Clarice sat down, Her hands trembled, and for the first time in 10 years, tears fell from her eyes, not from longing, but from fear. Fear that Marvin had finally seen the part of her life she had buried in dreams. Chapter 5. The Final Tape. Not every affair begins with a touch. Some begin with a song, one that plays only in your head, never aired on the radio. No one knows the lyrics. Only your own heart knows every note and every silence in between. After leaving George's house, Marvin drove nearly 2 hours south of Atlanta to a place he'd never been before, Studio Jubilee, a place where time wore no disguise, peeling wooden doors, a faded sign. Inside, the scent of old tobacco and sun-warmed leather still clung to the air like ghosts refusing to leave. Otis, the studio owner, black, near 70, half bald, thick glasses, looked up when Marvin walked in. "You're not an artist, Pastor?" Marvin nodded. He wasn't surprised. Men who'd lived in music could smell grief like bloodhounds. "I'm looking for a recording from around 1998. The sender's name was Ezra." Otis didn't say a word. He stood, walked into the back storage room. 10 minutes later, he returned with a small reel tape in a rusted tin case. On the label, just 3 handwritten words in black marker. "For her only." Otis loaded the reel into the machine. The tape whirred to life, familiar, dusty, like the sound of time unraveling. Marvin sat down in a cracked leather chair. His heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of a prayer. And then the guitar. Not mournful, not loud, just slow, deliberate, and aching. Every note felt like a confession, not begging for forgiveness, just hoping someone was still listening. Ezra's voice began. "Clarice, I don't know if I'm still alive, but if you're hearing this, then I'm no longer in your life, only in your flesh, where music once touched." Marvin closed his eyes, his hand clenched into a fist on his thigh. "You used to sing like you weren't afraid to love, and I used to touch you, like the world wouldn't exist tomorrow." The guitar stopped, only breath remained. Then, a creak, a bed shifting, a moan, soft, familiar. "Clarice." Not words, just a sound Marvin had heard on many nights, never realizing it wasn't meant for him. Otis turned toward him, his face heavy. "You know, I almost erased this tape, but something in his voice told me it wasn't just a song. It was a goodbye from a man who once lived entirely on love." Marvin couldn't stay seated. He asked for a copy. Otis didn't charge him, just looked at him and said, "I'm an old man, but if I knew someone held my wife's heart that long, I wouldn't be angry. I'd be afraid." On the drive home, Marvin didn't turn on the radio, didn't pray. He just kept thinking, how many parts of Clarice do I not know? How many parts of her still sleep next to me every night, but don't belong to me? Back home, Clarice was by the window, reading scripture. Afternoon light spilled through the curtains, painting a soft halo on her hair. She looked up at him with eyes he'd known for over a decade. But now, he wasn't sure if those eyes still looked at him, or at a memory that refused to die, He placed the tape on the table, said nothing. Clarisse looked at the rusted tin, her lips pressed together. She didn't ask. She just exhaled as if what Marvin had brought home wasn't a recording, but the body of a man she'd buried alive inside herself. Marvin turned away, went into his study, closed the door, put on his headphones, and listened. Every word, every breath, every sound soaked in longing that he once believed only he had earned from the woman he married. No rage, no shouting, just one tear slipping down his face. And then he asked himself, how do you forgive when what you're supposed to forgive is something you never got to touch? Chapter 6. The dream you can't wake up from. That night, Clarisse didn't dream, no moaning, no whispering Ezra's name, because Marvin no longer slept in their room. He was downstairs, on the old sofa, not out of anger, but because he no longer had the strength to pretend that he was the one being loved. Clarisse knew. She rose earlier than usual, brewed coffee, set the table, waited. Marvin didn't come up. She poured 2 cups, but one sat there, cooling slowly on the table, and for the first time in years, she had nowhere left to hide. When she opened the door to his study, Marvin was sitting with his back to her, sunlight spilling through the window onto his shoulders. Clarisse stood silently. After a long moment, Marvin spoke, not loud, not accusing. I heard it all, the song, the way you breathed, when you still loved someone else. No one cried, no one yelled, just a silence so heavy, even the ticking wall clock felt rude. Clarisse stepped in, sat across from him. Her eyes did not flinch. I didn't know you found the tape. You didn't, but your body did, every night. Clarisse looked down. Her hands trembled, tapping her knees like drumming a rhythm from long ago. I didn't choose Ezra. You know that. Marvin nodded. But you never really chose me either. The pause that followed was longer than any Sunday sermon. Clarisse whispered, I died that night. When the car flipped, the part of me that loved him died with the child I lost, but the part that survived prayed for someone like you. Marvin looked at her. Not angry, just hurting because he realized he hadn't been betrayed by someone alive, but by someone already gone, and that someone was still living inside the woman he loved every single day. I know I wasn't your first choice, Marvin said, but I wanted to be, at least, your last. Clarisse cried. Not loudly, just a single tear wiping away the final trace of memory. I tried to forget, but the harder I tried, the clearer it became. You don't need to forget, Marvin replied. You need to forgive yourself. That night, Marvin came back to their bedroom. He didn't touch Clarisse, just lay beside her listening to her breathe. No heaviness, no moaning, no names. The next morning, she handed him a small wooden box. Inside was a silver bracelet, engraved with the words, Ezra, min 1998. I've kept it all these years, Clarisse said, but now I want you to have it. Because if you forgive, then you have the right to bury it. That afternoon, Marvin dug a small hole in the backyard. Not for someone who had died, but for a piece of the past they had carried together in silence for over a decade. He placed the bracelet in the earth, covered it, and whispered, not to forget, but to no longer fear remembering. Clarice stood behind him, quietly holding his hand. For the first time, there was no shadow of another man between them. That night, she slept, peacefully, no dreams, no names. And when Marvin reached over to rest his hand on hers, she smiled. In her sleep, for the first time in 11 years, the only name she called out was his, a love note at the end. Some stories don't need a climax. They just need a wife who once breathed another man's name in her sleep, and a husband patient enough to stay through the silence, brave enough to love all the way through. If you've stayed with us until this moment, we thank you deeply, because somewhere out there, someone may be lying beside the one they love, while their dreams still whisper another name. If this story stirred a memory in you, a feeling you've never spoken out loud, leave us a comment below. We believe someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if you'd like to keep walking with us through the whispers beneath Beauty Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and share this video with someone you believe needs to feel something real again. Every comment, every share is a spark that keeps tales of black alive. Because here, we tell the stories that others only dare to carry in silence. Thank you. We'll see you in the next story, where beauty doesn't just live on the surface, but in the parts that survive after everything else has broken.